Okay, so I'm not going to introduce Keith Comito since he needs no introduction here. Joining me on this panel are Matthew Oki O'Connor of Celerity Therapeutics. He's the CEO of Scientific Affairs. Dr. O'Connor was a researcher administrator at the SENS Research Foundation from 2010 to 2019, where he headed up the MitoSENS team until 2016, which we actually partially funded some of their work early on when we started Lifespan.io. Kenneth Bogner, who's from the Montana Senate. He's a state senator, so he's an American politician. He's a member of representing the 19th District, if you're from Montana and know that district. Dylan Livingston, Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, founder and president. He helped found the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, a 501c4 nonprofit organization focused on advocating for government-sponsored initiatives and policies to increase healthy human lifespan. I believe Ben Armstrong is not joining us yet. Yep. And Jay Robertson of Prospera, VP of Development. Prospera is a private city and special economic zone on the island of Roatan in the Central American state of Honduras. The city is an autonomous zone with private government and its own fiscal, regulatory, and legal architecture. I have two questions to that. Can you do that? And number two, what size military do you have?
Good question.
Anyway, so pass the mic over to you.
Yeah. Feel free to have a seat, Oliver, maybe if you want to. Sure. We have a gap.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Oliver, and I'm looking forward to this panel. I hope everyone's having a good first day of the conference as we're coming to a close. And as Oliver mentioned, we're about to dive into the topic of the regulatory frameworks and policy landscape for both aging research and blockchain technology, and what breakthroughs might lead to progress in that regard. Now, we're a man down on the blockchain side, so I'll try to fill in a little bit. But to start things off here, I'd like to have the audience learn a little bit more about your respective work and how it relates to government regulation and matters of policy. So maybe, Dylan, you can begin for us, since I know that you're instrumental in building caucuses, et cetera, for longevity. So.
Yeah, I guess I'm a caucus expert, you could call me. No, I'm just kidding. So I am Dylan Livingston. I am the founder and president of the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. We are a 501c4 organization, as was mentioned, which is important because we are the only 501c4 organization in this field, which means we are the only organization in the nonprofit space in the longevity field that can advocate to the government for policy, legislation, and initiatives to help the longevity field. We got together the Longevity Science Caucus. We were instrumental in establishing that in February of 2023, this year. The caucus is bipartisan, which is great to see. Longevity is an issue that affects everybody, so it's great to see both sides of the aisle coming together on this. I'll pass it on to Ken here. But the next big piece of work we did was with Ken here. We passed a law in Montana that expands eligibility for right to try. And so I'll let Ken talk a little more about that.
Sure, yeah, Ken. So if you can give us a brief description of your work.
Yeah, I'm Ken Bogner. I'm state senator for Southeast Montana. I'm also the president pro tem of the Montana Senate, and focusing on passing legislation and doing agency review at the state level. Recently got into longevity policy in the last year. Met Dylan, and we started working on legislation for the Montana 68th session this last January through May, and we came up with a bill to expand medical right to try in Montana. We have it at the federal level, but only terminally ill patients can use the law. In Montana, talking with Dylan, we came up with a bill that expanded that to anyone who is willing to, who wants to try, as long as they've explored other options and that they can find a provider who wants to work with that patient. Took some work, took all session, but we got it passed, and the governor signed that bill into law at the end of May. In fact, actually, while I'm here, the governor gave me the pen that he used to sign that bill, so I wanted to give that to Dylan for all your work on that bill.
Thank you very much, Governor, and thank you, Ken.
Great. Yes. So just to keep things moving on just this introductory question, Jay, I'd like to kick it over to you because obviously you're moving in a different direction. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is actually in public policy. Studied political science and spent a lot of time working on the state level here in the U.S. and joined Prospera about 3 years ago when we publicly launched as a special jurisdiction. So the exciting thing about Prospera is it presents an opportunity for us to rethink how we would do regulation. If we could start from scratch and build a regulatory and licensing model that's built for the 21st century, learning from the best practices of what works in some places and what doesn't work in others, maybe more importantly, how do we do it differently? And so that's what we've done at Prospera. We have a system, the first in the world, to our knowledge, that allows for regulatory choice, where companies and patients can choose the regulatory environment that works best for them, balancing the risks there and ensuring there's accountability and public safety. And we've had a great response working with companies like MiniCircle that are conducting clinical trials in Prospera, and groups like VitaDAO and others working in the regenerative medicine space to more quickly deploy research and actually bring therapies to market, treating patients there in row 10.
Great. Yeah, that's a really novel, innovative idea, this whole idea of charter cities and everything like that. So it's very fascinating, and that's a good segue over to Oki here from the perspective of a researcher in your interactions with the regulatory framework.
Yeah, so I'm Matthew O'Connor. Everyone calls me Oki, and I spun out a company, Cyclarity Therapeutics, from the SENS Foundation three and a half years ago. And so from a biology of aging perspective, that our philosophy is to target damage that accumulates with age. And so, our first drug targets oxidized cholesterol that accumulates with age, and our first indication is cardiovascular disease. But traditionally, cardiovascular disease is looked at by counting heart attacks and strokes and dead bodies. And we're targeting a very specific molecule that is just really bad across all of biology. And if you could wave a magic wand and make it go away, you'd all just be better off. But the question is, how do you get from there to drug approval and hopefully avoid your initial drug approval needing to take 5 or 10 years and needing tens of thousands of patients and billions of dollars. So that's the challenge that I've been struggling with and learning about these last couple of years.
I think that's a challenge that all of us have been struggling with. So now that we kind of have the stage set, I'm going to start asking questions to the floor, and we all can jump in. So the first one is, ostensibly, one of the purposes of regulation and governmental policies is to maximize the wellness of its citizens, right, both physically and financially. But I don't think I'm breaking any news by saying that maybe we're not doing the most awesome job in the past couple of years. For example, in the U.S., despite spending twice as much on healthcare as the average OECD country, our outcomes are some of the worst, and life expectancy is actually dropping. So the question to the floor is, in your opinion, what specifically might be going wrong policy-wise, and how can we work together to fix it? Open question to whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'll jump in and say that I think the reticence to embrace biomarkers, or more commonly in regulatory parlance, is surrogate endpoints, which can be a spectrum of meanings. And trying to get drugs approved, whether it's conditionally or accelerated approval, and having that be the first line rather than the exception, I think is a challenge. And how can you make those existing programs, the conditional / accelerated / adaptive licensing, depending on which country you're in. That's what I'm most interested in, and it doesn't quite work yet. And figuring out how to make it work and make it work more efficiently, I think, would help a lot.
I obviously agree that biomarkers are super important, which is why I spend a lot of time working on non-invasive biomarkers. But I'd like to kick this over to the legislator side of the table over there. Do you see this as the primary issue, or are you encountering other things that you think are more primary roadblock?
Yeah, well, as a Republican politician, I think the government's gotten too involved. Now, we need the government to set standards and keep individuals and entities accountable. But we've moved, governments have moved past that, state governments, federal governments, to where now they're creating protectionist policies. And they're not allowing some of the free market qualities that we take seriously, or should be taking seriously in the US. We need to let the innovators, a lot that we've heard today, to innovate. And this is why I'm up here because I got interested in longevity because my constituents were having trouble with the way the government was creating winners and losers and not letting people innovate and people who want to use those innovations to use them. I hope that answers your question or is general enough to what I feel the issue is the government needs to be there, but it's gone too far. It's too involved.
Do you agree with that, Dylan?
I'm going to not comment on that as a politically neutral human being. However, I do think, and Ken may agree with me on this, that there's just a general lack of awareness among policymakers, right? I speak to a congressperson and then they go off to the next meeting, right? I mean, they have 50 different meetings set up in one day and it's hard for them to compartmentalize and, focus on one thing. And it's that, that's the design of the job, right? And so I really do, it's a bit of a cop-out answer if you ask me, but I really do think awareness and continuing to push the message to the highest possible, highly influential people is the way to push this forward and get better healthcare solutions in America. That's obviously the political lobbyist answer, but that's the one I'm given.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back. Oh, sorry, Ken, you want to jump in?
Well, no, I agree with that as well. When an issue is complex, politicians don't want to touch it, or they end up regulating something they don't know enough about. And that is what I see is happening. And when I say the government's getting too involved, I see that aspect more, regulating something that they don't know enough about or relying on too few voices.
I was just going to bounce it over to you, Jay. Is the answer of special economic zones to do more and better regulation or less regulation?
Well, I think from our perspective, we're trying to build an alternative model that tries to prove a different way of doing things. And so from our perspective, the challenge with regulation is that you usually have one centralized body with a monopoly on granting approvals whose incentives are often not aligned with those of the actual patients or people who are trying to create new therapies. And so we've created a system of choice to where the incentives are properly aligned to ensure that innovators can do what they do best. And our Prospera Council is actually structured as fiduciaries. So they have a very high standard of responsibility to ensure that they're approving regulatory frameworks that allow for innovation while also protecting public safety. And it's undergirded by insurance. And so, as opposed to having one centralized regulatory body that sets one set of rules that generally grows and ossifies over time, you have multiple different pathways to approval. So we're introducing market forces and competitive dynamics to regulation for the first time.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost allowing people to choose, right, what kind of regulation they want to live under, right? I want to circle back to the earlier topic because there was obviously this sense of, right-wing perspective versus left-wing perspective. So I would like to think that things like longevity would be the ultimate nonpartisan issue, right, because it affects everybody. And I think, in terms of the caucus so far, I think it is bipartisan. But in particular on the cryptocurrency side, I think it's clear to me at least that it's cryptocurrency, blockchain technology is sort of seen as kind of a right-wing / libertarian thing. And personally to me, that makes me a little bit sad because I think that when applied properly, those technologies can be used to bring the fruition of things like guaranteed minimum income, Medicare for all, et cetera. So the question that I have, maybe starting on that side of the room, is how do you think that we can make sure that we move forward in a bipartisan way if we think this is useful, or do you think that that's not necessary for progress?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to go back to the bill that passed this last legislative session in Montana with the expanding medical right to try. The far left said this is just going to allow people who wanted to take certain medicines during the pandemic to do that. We don't want to allow them to do that. The right-wing side, well, this is just so the left can, use their mushrooms and whatever other drugs they want. Now, this was both ends of the spectrum, so, they were going to be upset either way. So to answer your question and how we got this bill passed is we used the right language and we found the right ambassadors. And we made sure that we were talking in terms, I mean, right now we're so polarized that there's certain trigger words that as soon as you hear them, one side is not going to like it or the other side is. And you need to make sure that we're saying the right words that prevent an issue from becoming polarized. You mentioned it's more of a cryptos and blockchains, more of a right-wing libertarian type policy. It doesn't have to be that way. You just got to make sure that you're not coupling it with other issues that are polarizing, and that your ambassadors aren't polarizing as well. And it's not just Republican versus Democrat. Right now we're polarized, wealthy versus poor, urban versus rural. My recommendation is just be very careful who you're picking for ambassadors and language, and use that to break into the other side.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when we started A4LI, it was, day one, it was our intent to make this a bipartisan effort. I am a Democratic-leaning person in my background. I would say, as I mentioned before, I'm politically neutral. But it would have been really easy to just lean into those connections that I've made. But I realized quickly that, if we want the longevity advocacy movement to have longevity in of itself, we need to work with both sides of the aisle, because the political environment changes every 2 years, right? And we can't get legislation passed if we're only working on one side of the aisle. So, and the good news is we really have something here that is a bipartisan issue, right? We did some polling back in 2022 that shows, I believe it was 57% of Trump voters supported medical advancements to cure aging, 66% of other or nonpartisan, and 81% of Biden voters. And so you show me another political issue in America with that kind of numbers, and I'll probably call you a liar, because nothing is like that. I mean, it's, that is as little polarized as anything out there. So we have a winning issue, and I think the more we push it out to the masses, the more people will kind of see the light and come on our team.
Jay, from your perspective, the people that are receptive to the message of network states, is there a partisan lean to it? Is it everybody's coming to the table together? What's your
Yeah, so most of our residents are people who are sick of the polarized environment and are trying to exit to a place where we haven't concentrated all that decision-making authority in a centralized body that's going from red to blue back and forth and always angering 51% of the population. So in Prospera, we've purposefully structured the system so that most of that decision-making authority is decentralized to third-party insurance companies who are writing insurance policies that provide coverage for patients and providers, assessing independently the risk of what's happening there. And so, from our perspective, it's about building an alternative system. And I think that's also helpful, not just for people who are conducting research or want to bring therapies to market and want to come to Prospera to use it as a launch pad or a sandbox for them to innovate. That's our business model, and that's what we provide. But as a U.S. citizen myself, I also think it's important to build this out as an example to say these sorts of policy experiments can work in the real world. And so for every successful drug that is tested and tried in Prospera and is brought to market, we're building a body of evidence that shows there's a better way to do medical regulation in a way that fosters innovation safely. And so in my experience actually lobbying at the state level, I also found that that's one of the most helpful tools you can use when trying to change policy is to point at other states. So if you can find other places that have successfully enacted a policy, that usually gets policymakers' attention. And so I think ideally we're building something in Prospera at scale that can be used to model and replicate in other places to use for a new system of regulation.
Well, I find that to be an encouraging answer, that people are looking for less division, because
I'll give you a little credit.
Yeah.
When we started out thinking of Right to Try, we were looking at Prospera as a model.
Great.
So kudos to you guys. That's what you guys are doing a good job.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, and just that, it's encouraging, because I really feel like Dylan was mentioning, that a lot of these issues are popular, but for some reason that's just not properly perceived, or people have a vested interest in making you think that it's not popular or unanimous when it actually is. So it's encouraging to know that people are going to something like Prospera kind of get that. And then now to a question related to this that I legitimately don't know the answer to for Oliver and Oki. From the researcher perspective, do you find that you're kind of insulated from this idea of like whether the funding sources have any kind of partisanship to them or not, or does that actually affect things at all from your perspective as a researcher? Either of you.
Are you talking about like political partisanship?
Or, yeah, or just like, does, the funding sources, like it doesn't matter, like to you, you just say, oh, it's a grant or whatever, or like, do you find yourself having to think about like, we need to advocate to have Senate Appropriations Committee pass this so that I can get more funding at my university, and that has a partisan aspect to it or something?
I mean, I can't comment on something I'm specifically working on because I don't think it applies here. Keith, you're working with it on me, which is Alzheimer's related, right? But certainly certain research topics can be really a political hot button, and then it depends. It really matters where funding is coming from, and a great prime example from that is embryonic stem cell research, going back a number of years to the Bush administration, where that was highly polarized, and you had federal funding cut off at least for a period of time, and then states took on their own initiatives, right? So, and people were scrambling to find money from alternative sources. So, it really depends on what the what the research is. It's sort of a moot point now because of iPSC technologies. But something else could rear its head, right, in the near future. So it depends on. So yes, it could matter greatly if it's a specific topic of research. Certainly, right now, research in certain drugs that are classified as Schedule I drugs that you really can't do much research on because they show great efficacy in small trials, like psilocybin-based research, right? Talking about magic mushrooms, but the government's not going to touch that. They'll throw you in jail, right? Just because it's forbidden, just by decree, no other reason. And we've seen a softening of that on a statewide basis, at least for cannabis research, for example. So. Politics does get intertwined with this, depending on what the research project is, and that will obviously squelch not only the funding source, but even your very ability to carry out that research in a certain geographic zone.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd say that from the big picture. Being nonpartisan and approaching it from that direction is something that I think I endorse, and proud member of A4LI, and I think that's the right approach. I guess to dovetail on something that Oliver was saying, these things can suddenly become partisan. Another example is I think there was a court decision maybe in Texas that tried to change regulation of a medication. I can't remember if it was the morning after pill or a different kind of birth control, and that provoked a reaction from the pharmaceutical industry, which was the courts need to not be trying to regulate pharmaceuticals. That's the job of regulators who are addressing these things from a public health and from a medical perspective. So I guess you could argue, since that was a conservative decision, but also to our Republican colleagues' point, it could be seen as government overreach from the courts. So you never know when you're suddenly going to be finding yourself on one or the other side of a political debate.
Got it. To kind of change gears slightly, but to a related question, obviously AI has been all over the news lately, right? And it's no secret that there's this confluence between decentralized science, aging research, how AI can help aging research, but it's also become, I don't want to say partisanly polarizing, but polarizing in the sense that a lot of people are scared of it, right? So how do you negotiate sort of working with AI, how much you want to play that up or downplay it? Maybe Ken or Dylan could also, is this coming into intersection with any legislation that might be relevant for the restriction of AI, et cetera? Like, how strongly do we want to couple these things or try to separate them?
Well, from my conversations, it seems that people being scared of AI is a bipartisan issue, right? I think both sides of the aisle have their concerns, and you can blame Elon Musk or the Terminator or whoever you want, but AI has been in the public spotlight for decades, right? And it's scary, it's scarier. I remember I looked at a poll recently from May of this year that showed that 61% of people were scared of AI and 22% were not. And so, I mean, compare that with our poll. I mean, it's clear that people are more scared of AI and its implications. I think that in terms of perception in the public eye, it's good for the longevity industry and it's bad for the longevity industry. We don't have the same level of fear that we kind of give people when talking about what we're doing that AI does. So we're not going to grab the headlines, I don't think, the way that AI kind of has. But, that's a good thing in some ways because we're not going to be in the spotlight and our researchers can do their thing while, we're not in the spotlight. And then one day we'll have a chat GPT-esque, device in the longevity industry and it'll, be a part of everybody's daily lives and we'll get some more focus on it from that. But, I think they're two different challenges and they're two different industries. And just from the legislative aspect, I right now don't see any way for what we're advocating for in AI kind of intersecting. But obviously, I'm not a researcher. Oki can probably talk about this more. AI is involved with everything nowadays, right? So the advancements in AI are good for the field, but I don't think, people are going to equate AI with longevity and vice versa.
I think it's interesting when you look at the discussions around AI regulation, you see it playing out in much the same way this happens in other fields. I talked earlier about incentives, and one of the problems with having a centralized regulatory authority with a monopoly on approvals is they're susceptible to regulatory capture by the industries they are purported to be regulating. And so in the case of the FDA, when it comes to longevity or biotech, or at the SEC when it comes to blockchain products or crypto projects, those agencies create uncertainty in the marketplace and are usually responsive to established players in those industries. And I think it's interesting you see the largest companies who work on AI now coming out and calling for regulation of AI, obviously usually in a way that would favor the incumbents in the market and potentially diminish innovation there. And so I think it's important to think about regulation as not just a something that's a magical product of the legislature. They're also susceptible to industry pressures, which I think you certainly see in the medical space as well.
Absolutely. I want to pivot this to the researchers where on the cryptocurrency side, it seems like there's some clarity on what would be the things that would unshackle the gates, right? Clarity from the SEC, the whole Ripple lawsuit, et cetera. So I think we kind of understand what that looks like. What would be the bellwethers of, okay, we know what to do. Do we feel that there's similar things that we're waiting to happen, like classifying aging a disease, et cetera, that are those similar bellwethers for aging research? You can take this from the crypto side as well if you like. But or what are the most exciting things? We talked about earlier in workshops. We have new initiatives like ARPA-H, deploying more money potentially to aging, so that's more funding. But are there more systemic things that need to happen? What's the critical breakthrough that will really unlock the doors? Any clear ideas on that, or it's still just an open question?
Yeah, good. Is that Carl? Yes. I think what we said earlier, getting approval, even if it's temporary, conditional approval or something like that on the basis of surrogate biomarkers, I think would be a big step forward. And on top of awareness and sufficient funding for the kinds of things that us aging companies are going after, I feel like that would make the biggest difference.
Okay, let me pivot off or build off of that. So what exactly specifically does that look like? So there's been previous initiatives with like near Barzilai and the metformin TAM trial and how to get a proxy indication for aging, et cetera. Is it clear what exactly this would be, or is there still a committee needs to be formed to understand what exactly that indication would be? And do we have any clarity on what the steps are to get the vision is clear, but like the techne of how to do that, is that clear too, or is that still a discussion that the field is coming to?
Well, there's definitely a discussion, and there are frameworks and there are precedents. So, for example, lowering LDL cholesterol is an acceptable surrogate endpoint for at least conditional approval of a new drug. That's obviously sounds kind of boring to everyone in this room, right? But what about something that near and dear to my heart, artery disease? You might think, well, if I could take an artery that was 75% blocked and then reduce that by some big amount, say reduce it down to only 10% blocked, that should be an obvious win, right? That should just get approval on that basis. And the answer is no. That's a surrogate endpoint, and that's not, under the way that the regulations are written right now, an acceptable endpoint for the success of a phase 3 clinical trial and moving to approval. So you would need an exception to get approval on that basis. That said, I think most of the regulatory agencies in the world have some mechanism for making a case that you can and should get at least temporary approval on the basis of a endpoint like that if you can make a good case for it. Unfortunately, it's still more the exception than the rule, and there's big bars to be jumped over, during and after that.
I'm curious if Oliver has any thoughts, but one thing that I'd say too is that, building off of that, what I would love to see personally, a holy grail from my perspective, is if we can get some sort of generally agreed upon proxy metric for biological aging based on like non-invasive data combined in the right way, like walking, gait, voice, et cetera, something that can be applied quickly as like an early signal that can sort of become a secondary indication for any trial. Like, is there a deviation between chronological and biological age going on, and flagging that for further interest. So I think that would be a holy grail for me. Oliver, any follow-ups, or should we go to the next question?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I think what Oki mentioned, the example of cholesterol-lowering drugs like statins, which, higher levels of cholesterol doesn't necessarily mean that you have heart disease, right? It means that it's an indicator that you will get that. So you're way at the prodromal stage. So you're not exhibiting any kind of other symptoms. Yet we have drugs for that would lower that. So we have indications that is going to stave off heart disease. So I think, right now there's probably a lot of other early stage markers out there that will lead to diseases of aging that we can develop drugs for. Currently, and have an indicator showing that we can give this to quote unquote healthy people that are not exhibiting overt signs of disease yet, but that will stave off the disease later, like taking statins, for example, early on. So there's already that example out there in the medical community. So I think it's really more the ball's in the court of aging research and science. I don't think we need to worry about semantics like calling aging a disease or not. I'll leave that up to the medical community, but I just think that's semantics. I think once a number of drugs start coming out to the market that basically will affect multiple markers at once and show that affects many different diseases of aging later down the line, then maybe those definitions will change later. But I don't see that as a roadblock per se right now for the development of such drugs, because we already have a framework in place to bring them into market.
Yeah, I agree with that personally. I think we need to have something codified, but what we call that doesn't necessarily matter. I want to pivot this to a somewhat spicy question, and too bad Ben Armstrong isn't here, because I know that he would have a spicy take on this one. Affecting both blockchain technology and longevity, radical new technologies, transformative new technologies. One of the things that I hear commonly that people lament is, our politicians are so old, we have a gerontocracy, like that's why they can't adopt these new things. They don't even know what an NFT is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very easy for that to kind of go into ageism, right? I have my own thoughts here, but do you think that this is a real issue? And if so, what are constructive solutions to it? This might be term limits, et cetera, rather than just saying this person is old, they're bad. So this could be a spicy question, but what are your thoughts on this? How can we have a government that is more responsive to the needs of the people? Is age a factor in that?
Sure. I do think there needs to be term limits. I don't think that solves the issue, though, because an individual can. We're seeing it now at the federal level, where winners of U.S. Senate races and congressional races are starting older. So even if you have term limits, they're still going to be in that upper echelon of age, I guess you could call it. But I do think there should be a competency test once you get to the federal level, even at the state level too. We see people that are serving decades that are struggling to get to their seats and need help with basic votes, basic stuff in the process that they've done for years. It's just not there. So I would say a cognitive test and term limits.
Yeah, I don't think it's really an age question. I think it's more of a competency question, right? You could be 85, 90 years old and still have your wits about you and be a great congressperson, or you could be a 50-year-old and not, right? So I think this really is more of a competency question than anything else. I don't like when people talk about how old all of our Congress people are. It makes me feel some kind of way that I don't really have the words for right now, but I don't like it. It kind of puts a negative light on something that we're all going to end up becoming, hopefully, right? I mean, if we can get that long, right? But yeah, I don't. Nancy Pelosi was the head of the Democratic Party in the House until last year, and Mitch McConnell is still running the Senate, right? So I don't think it's an age question. I'll put it there.
Yeah, to pivot this to Oliver, I know you already have some thoughts, but you just made me think of when you said Mitch McConnell. There's obviously been a few politicians on both sides of the aisle that are clearly exhibiting neurological issues, right? So in addition to a potential idea of cognitive tests, what do you feel, Oliver, about if it's clear that politicians are having neurological difficulties? It's kind of a landmine question, but do you think that should trigger something or not? Or
Well, I think this question of term limits and other things should be an ageism. We should bifurcate that into two parts. Questions of competency and whether somebody's too old to serve, and not just looking at age per se, but competency in general, right? So somebody can be completely competent at 80 versus 50, right? So that's a separate issue versus term limits because of issues of entrenchment, right? So let's say we don't age anymore, right? Somebody could still become entrenched and still be competently fine, but not moving, not leaving that position because they've accrued too much power, right? So that's, I think, a separate issue. And it just so happens that older people that are more experienced tend to accrue more power because they've been around longer, right? So those two things get conflated together. And I think we need to separate those two issues, in my opinion. And I think the spiciest take on this was a researcher, I don't know his name, a long time ago, who said something to the effect that science progresses when the old scientists drop dead.
One funeral at a time. Yeah. I'll circle back on that in a second, but Jay, governance in Prospera, is there a danger of gerontocracy or whatever this phenomenon is, or are you proactively seeking to mitigate this?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of just wanting to point out, if we could just solve this, if we could just institute term limits, that would fix it. But in reality, we know that the political system is broken because it's only in the political system where we get these kind of results. Where if you could build something that selects leaders differently or devolves the decision making to the market. There are plenty of professionals that are older that do a great job, and the market chooses to select those people because they provide a better service. So as opposed to relying on an agency head that's appointed by a lifetime politician to make that decision, what if we could rely on an insurer that's selected by the market? That's how we approach it, is just devolving the decision making from the political process. And the bigger issue also is that it's not just the figureheads we see in Congress, it's this massive bureaucracy that works behind the scenes at places like the FDA that are subject to those market forces from the big players in the market that often hinder research or innovation from startups. And so from our perspective, that's what we're providing as an alternative where you're not going to face regulatory bottlenecks, you're able to get approvals quickly, and there's regulatory clarity. And you don't have to worry about how old the technical secretary of Prospera is, because you don't have to get his permission to start your company and do research. You can form an LLC, you can get an insurance policy and have an expert review what you're doing and get approval to operate in a fraction of the time that it would take to do in the United States. So from our perspective, it's just building an alternative model where we don't have those types of dependencies.
Okay, do you have any thoughts on this, or these alternative models you think attractive in any way that might resolve bottlenecks due to potential calcification of government, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't, I guess the biggest, as a sort of a technical person, the biggest frustration for me in politics and politicians is, you see an old congressperson or something, or not necessarily old, let's just say an incompetent, congressperson saying absurd things, asking absurd questions to, people, heads of companies or something like that, asking, what kind of a business model is Facebook. It's embarrassing. And I feel like some of the solution for that, and I don't know how you would legislate this, but it would be nice to see more technical people in government, and not just as technocrats at agencies like FDA and NIH or wherever, but also in government. Where are all the engineers and medical doctors and scientists in elected office? Sometimes it feels like it's run by MBAs and lawyers, and it's good that there's some of them there, but maybe not all business and legal people.
So maybe some kind of mechanisms to make the legislative body just more diverse and representative of the population at large. Yeah, very interesting. My own personal 2 cents on this are kind of somewhat similar to Oliver, of trying to disaggregate these things, and I'm not opposed to things like cognitive testing, once a year or something like that. Although, of course, there's a danger for that, who watches the Watchmen kind of syndrome, the tests can be racist and things like that, so you have to be very careful about that. But what I think here, and I think these moments when politicians are having neurological issues, something that I don't think we've leveraged as a community. You got to do it carefully, but maybe Dylan, you might have some thoughts about, but keep it in your head for now because we're wrapping up. I think of this as a teachable moment to society of that it's not necessarily the number that's the problem. It's the degeneration, right? So if we can promote neuroplasticity, if we make a world where everyone can operate as if they're 25 years old, maybe this will allay some aspects of this issue, and we should speak to it from that angle, although the point that Oliver made of just like entrenchment is also an issue. But I think that there's a teachable moment there where we say, hey, don't yell at Trump or Biden because they're 80, but because maybe they're having some struggles, and we should figure out maybe as a society ways to overcome those struggles. So that's what I would like to think. But with that, before we fully wrap up, I'd like to just open it to the floor. Is there any questions for any of the panelists that anybody has from the audience? Maybe someone could run a microphone. I see we got one from Arcadia out there. Thanks, man.
Hi, sorry, I have a question for all the panelists probably. I was wondering, when rooting and lobbying for deregulation, shouldn't we be just a tiny bit, and I can't stress enough, just a tiny bit, careful about what we wish, because given the huge price of a potential mistake on the field as a whole, like if tomorrow a botched trial of a longevity drug kills a few people, it can just throw the whole field into limbo. I was wondering if any of you has thoughts on that.
I could just give one thing. So that we did take that into consideration. And so in the law, it states that the drugs have to be past phase 1. And so we hope with that we can mitigate some of the risk there. But the point of the bill is for people to take their own health into their own hands and make their own decisions, right? So there's going to be risk. But it's, past phase 1, so the risk should be significantly less. In Montana, specifically.
And, as a politician, when a lobbyist comes to me, I'm expecting them to ask the world. So I guess that's just something you need to decide to do, what you feel comfortable in your field doing. As a politician, it's my job to say, hey, this is what you want complete deregulation. Well, I got to convince 149 other legislators and a governor to sign this. So I've got to do, my job is to sift through that and say, okay, where is that line at? We're not going to completely deregulate you, but what can you work with? So, I mean, my suggestion is, ask for a lot, but what you're comfortable with, but be willing to work to that point where the legislature or legislative body is going to have to convince others that this isn't going too far, that you're going to have oversight, and that we can trust you.
Any other questions? All right, I'd like to quickly wrap up by just allowing each of you to, if you have anything you want to plug, or let everyone know where they can go to find out more about your work, we can just go down the line. So Ken, start with you.
Yeah, I guess before I plug my work, one suggestion would be to reach out to your local official, your state legislature, your congressional delegation, build a relationship with them. As you move forward, you may not have a regulatory request or ask to change law, but you may. And to have those relationships already built can go a long ways. So I would highly suggest reaching out to them, building a relationship, start educating them on your interests in the field. But you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I try to stay active. Ken Bogner, just search me and you can find me. If you have any suggestions on regulatory reforms or things you're running into, reach out. I would love to hear them. I'm new to longevity, just been doing this longevity policy in the less than a year. So I want to continue building on our win in Montana and taking those wins to the federal level. So reach out to me, I'll respond. Would love to hear your suggestions. So thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I'll just echo Ken. I spoke to the members of the caucus earlier in July, and they noted the few companies in the space that reached out to them. But it wasn't enough. Reach out more. Let them know that you are happy that they formed the caucus. Give them legislative suggestions and be active and involved because they see it and they hear it, right? So I'm putting it out to all of you. Write the members of the caucus and tell them that you support what they're doing. You can follow the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives on Twitter, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn. We are very active and we're constantly doing things, so you can follow us there and stay up to date with the latest in political advocacy for longevity.
I don't really have much to plug from a regulatory perspective, but I'm going to plug instead my monthly journal club that I have at lifespan.io. So if you want to take a deep dive on the latest research and longevity research that we hand select and go through as many of the figures as we can in about 1.5 hours and take questions from a live stream. Join me. We do this every month, usually the last Tuesday of the month, noon to about 1:30. And yeah, so go to our website, lifespan.io, and click on Journal Clubs, and join me.
So Prospera is a jurisdiction, and we're open for business today. So we're a special economic zone, and we're helping companies today conduct clinical trials and bring new therapies to market. If you'd like to learn more, looking for an opportunity to visit a beautiful Caribbean island, there will be a talk here tomorrow at 12:30 to cover an opportunity for you to do that. And we'll also be doing a workshop tomorrow upstairs at 2 o'clock with MiniCircle to go a little bit deeper on exactly how the regulatory process worked for them and what the specific advantages or disadvantages can be to consider that. And so we'd love to see you there if you're interested in learning more about that. But you can follow us on Twitter or X at Prospera Global.
My plea is to get interested and get educated about regulatory policy and regulatory rules. They're critical to the potential success of our industry, right? I think we're kind of at an inflection point where we have so much cool science going on, and I feel like the regulatory aspect of how are you going to translate this, not just as something that could be tried in humans in a in some theoretical way or something that could help humans, but how are you going to get it approved? How are you going to get it on the market so that it can help people So I really, I think there needs to be some tweaks, not necessarily tearing the whole system down, but maybe. But you know, I think if you just go into it with, well, everything's you know, messed up, so we just need to tear it all down, you probably don't know enough to rebuild it. So I encourage people to learn more about this. It's something I'm trying to learn more about, something I'm trying to write a paper about right now. And I'd love to talk more to anybody about it.
Great. Well, obviously, for my part, you know, lifespan.io, you'll probably get sick of seeing my face with a number of talks tomorrow. But I will say that I like that the common thread of all these answers was reach out and connect, work together, because that's the whole spirit of the longevity industry and also decentralization. So I'm happy that that was the take-home message. And with that, I want to thank all the panelists, thank everyone both for watching this panel and being part of the whole event. And with that, I think we're able to kick it back to Oliver to close us out for day one of the conference.
All right.